All right, let's take a look at lecture number 2 in the study of the Constitution. We're going to look real quickly at the compromises at the convention. As we talked about, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan were quite dividing, and the large states had their interests and the small states had their interests, and they had to come to some sort of compromise. It was to the point where they were about ready to shut down the convention. And the sectional interests of large states and the sectional interests of small states were ready to shut it down. So let's take a look at this piece in particular. We have a number of compromises I want to quickly look at because the Constitution is called by some to be just a bundle of compromises. And that's what I want us to think about. Is it just simply a bundle of compromises, or was there some wisdom in the compromises that they made? Not Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin says, at the time, given all of that tension, he said, "Henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business." Basically saying the tension is there, the division is there, it's widely known. We have to ask for the blessings of God before we do this work because that's how divided they are. The Great Compromise is a product of the work of a committee led by Roger Sherman, a delegate from Connecticut. And Roger Sherman is charged with trying to balance the interests of the large states that supported the Virginia plan and the interests of the small states which supported the New Jersey plan. And that committee comes up with a solution which is our modern understanding of government today, in a sense. They said, we'll have a bicameral legislature. New Jersey plan wanted one house. The Virginia plan wanted two. They get a bicameral legislature. The Virginia plan wanted proportional representation in all houses, whereas the New Jersey plan wanted only equal representation. They split. They split the difference. The Senate, in the Great Compromise, was given equal representation. One state, one vote. We know today that there are 2 senators per state. There's 50 states. There's a maximum of 100 senators. The only way that would change is if a new state were added or if the Constitution was completely rewritten. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, will be proportional representation. The more people you had, the more representatives you got. That favored the large states, whereas the Senate equal representation favored the smaller states. They also said that all taxing and spending bills would have to originate in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives was directly elected by the people, and that's why they should control the taxing and spending. They didn't want a government to get out of control like they had seen under England and in other places as well. While the Senate was given the right to approve the appointments of the president and to approve the treaties that were negotiated that the United States was a part of. This passed by a single vote. That's how divided the country was. That's how divided the Constitutional Convention was, by large state interests and small state interests. It passed by a single vote, and they were able then to move on to the next series of pieces. And the next conflict came in terms of slavery. Not the question of whether or not slavery should be allowed, however, but in a sense, how should slaves be counted? The representation question was settled, and now the South said, well, we want our slaves to be counted as full people. While the northern business interests are saying, you get free labor from them and you don't give them any rights, why do you want to count them as full people now? You can't have it one way. You can't have your cake and eat it too, essentially. So the South wanted to get as much voice as possible, so they fought for the slaves to be counted, and that's why the North opposed this. What ends up happening is a compromise. So you get a little bit more than half of your slaves counted. For every 5 slaves the South had, only 3 of them would be counted for population. So this is what's known as the 3/5 compromise. The idea here is that they'll get a little over half, they'll get a little bit more representation, but at least the North realizes that it's still limited. There was a part in there that said citizens, basically white people, would count as single persons, and all other persons would be counted as 3/5. It's an interesting thing, all other persons. That doesn't become illegal until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Never since then have we used the phrase all other persons count something differently, but in practice it does. They also said that for the next 20 years they would do nothing about the slave trade. The Southerners threatened to abandon the Constitutional Convention if they tried to ban slavery. So the convention, realizing that there was a tough issue in terms of slavery to deal with, said, we'll put it off for 20 years. The South liked that because they were hoping that slavery would become so entrenched that they never would deal with it. When we look at this, this is a chart that I want to make sure you understand and that you get down in your notes. That this, in a sense, was just a series of compromises, but they were compromises that needed to be made. You have the issue of large states versus small states. And these large states versus small states were fighting the Virginia plan versus New Jersey plan. And so the compromise that had to be settled, that had to be made, was the Great Compromise. The House and the Senate was created. The Virginia plan was used in some way, and the New Jersey plan was used in another way. The second compromise had to come on this perspective of how much power to give the national government. Most colonists and new states wanted to make sure that they didn't give too much power to the national government. They were afraid of a national government, whereas others were saying, look what happened. We had no national government whatsoever under the Articles, and we were facing a crisis of confidence in the people. So the answer there is federalism. And when we look at federalism, what we're really looking at is, again, the sharing of power between the national government and the state government. But of course, then we have the North versus South, and that issue of slavery. Two things there, the 3/5 Compromise, and then the slave trade. Promising not to do anything about the slave trade and only counting some of those slaves in terms of population. These were big issues that needed to be settled, and had they not been settled at the convention, the country would have broken apart. In a sense, these are band-aids, because these things come back big and bad when we see the Civil War again in American history. They weren't able to solve the divisions between North and South. They weren't able to solve the question of states' rights. How much right does a state have versus how much a national government has? They weren't able to solve the issue of large state versus small state. There were sectional interests there. What they thought were compromises that would last for a long time would blow up in their face again in the Civil War. The question I want you to think about, though, in this process is, if our country was based on this level of compromise and all of these compromises, why is compromise such a bad word? Is compromise something that we're not willing to do in our country today? What's the political scenario? Why is the political climate such that Republicans won't compromise with Democrats and Democrats won't compromise with Republicans when our country is based on this idea of compromise? Please remember that what you need to do now after you've watched this is put a little response in that Google form on that question of compromises and that bundle of compromise. And we'll look forward to seeing you in class.